goes without saying that smartphones are the most popular way in the world to capture and record everything around us, everything that we experience in our day-to-day lives, our own little small parts of the world, those things that we enjoy every single day, and most importantly, to be able to create and capture memories instantly. We want to be able to capture these moments in time perfectly, these things that we only get one chance to experience in life. We want to be able to remember them forever. We want to be able to say we were there. I want to help you to take the best possible photographs that you can on your smartphone so that you never forget. My name is William Eames and welcome to the Smartphone Photography course. So as I mentioned, my name is William Eames. I am the head of the photography faculty education here in Shaw Academy. I have been a professional photographer now for over 10 years and I have been practicing photography for even longer than that. I have both a BA and an MFA in photography too. And for me, photography is a lifelong passion and something that we're always learning and always improving on, and that's what really appeals to me about it, is that it's something that we can endeavor to dedicate our lives to and still feel like we have never fully mastered it. Just a quick little bit of housekeeping to get through, just so you know how to attend all your lessons. You can attend via the app, you can attend via desktop, and indeed through your tablets as well. You will find on the website, you can log in there. You can also join your classes through our reminders that we send out to you via email. And indeed, you can log into your My Courses area and join your classes there and find a whole host of extras there as well. We do recommend that you download the app. It is the best way to experience all of the lessons and to be able to watch them on the go. And don't worry if you ever miss a lesson. It is possible to manage your class schedule. You can restart your course entirely if you want, and be sure to add to calendar and add push notifications so that you never ever need to miss a lesson. Now, so with that out of the way, let's get into our lesson proper, and welcome to lesson 1, the world of smartphone photography. I want you to start taking control, and in our first topic we're going to have a look at understanding our camera. We're going to break down how the camera actually works in our smartphones, because this is going to be very important for you understanding how to capture better photographs. It'll also demystify all of those terms that come along with our smartphones, so that you know exactly what to look for if you are thinking about upgrading your phone as well. So the first thing we're going to have a look at are some common terms that we need to get familiar with in relation to this topic. We're going to talk about our image sensors within our cameras. We'll have a look at our lenses, also very important. The aperture within our lenses as well. Talk shutter speeds, ISO, exposure, and resolution. I'm sure these are all terms that you may have heard before, and certainly if you are using a camera like a DSLR or a mirrorless camera, you may have come across these terms as well. But they work a little bit differently within our smartphone, so it's really important to understand what we're able to achieve within our smartphones and what our limitations are as well, so that we can get the best out of it too. And the first thing to have a look at, of course, is our image sensor. So imagine we're taking apart our smartphone, something I don't recommend that you do unless you know what you're doing. So we know how our cameras work on our phone, what each of the components do, and why understanding it is going to help improve your photography. So, kicking things off, let's have a look at the image sensor itself. This little device that's located within our cameras. This is where the magic happens. This is where the light is recorded onto the image sensor and creates our photograph. So the light hits our pixels, and through electronic device, it will transvert that light into a photograph that we can see. It'll turn it into a shot, and it really is almost like magic, but in reality it is science. So it's made up of light sensitive pixels. Each of these pixels reacts to light and will capture the different volumes, the different amount of light to make our photograph, to make our exposure. And the sensor captures and records light and electronically creates our digital photograph. Now, what the sensor also does, it understands how much time is needed to capture the photograph when we're photographing in our auto modes. So the sensor basically becomes active to the amount of light that it needs to capture the photograph, and will automatically cut that off when our exposure is finished. This is also known as our shutter speed. Certainly something we're going to be speaking about a lot more as we continue on through this lesson and indeed throughout this course. Now, looking at the second essential component to our cameras is, of course, the lens. This is how our cameras see, therefore how we see, and this is what captures the light. It contains many tiny pieces of glass known as elements. These little elements will take the light rays coming into the phone, and it'll bring them to a point where our image becomes into focus, and it'll also then move that light onto our image sensor. The light is bent through these little elements, allowing us to see through it. It also contains a very important component known as our aperture, which controls the volume of light that is coming in through the lens. Again, something we're going to be speaking a lot about throughout this course. Now, when we put it together, it's all housed in this tiny little device within our phones, and this is indeed our camera. It's a huge amount of technology in a tiny little bit of space. And at the front here, we can very, very clearly see our aperture. So this little opening here is where the light goes through, passes through the lens into the image sensor. This is known as our aperture. An aperture is an opening that allows something to pass through it. So, did you know that great things come in small packages? This is the actual size of the majority of our smartphone cameras and sensors. As you can see, they are absolutely tiny. Now, they do vary in size depending on the type of smartphone that you are using, some with slightly larger sensors and lenses, as we'll have a look at continuing on throughout the course. But for manufacturers advancing phone technology, smartphone cameras in particular, is a huge selling point in selling new phones. So the technology is constantly improving to the point where we are capable of capturing professional quality photographs on our smartphones. Now, there are, of course, advantages to using larger cameras with larger sensors. All these things we'll have a look at as we get towards the end of this course, but the advantages with smartphones are just numerous, as we will see, with instant sharing, with the ability to be able to have our phones on us nearly all of the time as well, to always be ready to take a photograph. Now, Moving on, let's have a look at the elements of exposure when we are capturing a photograph. So we've had a look at our image sensor, we've had a look at our lenses, but how then does the phone actually control the amount of light that's coming into the camera to create the photograph? Now, when I say exposure, I am speaking about the photograph itself. So if you don't understand what that word means, it's basically when we expose the camera sensor to light, this creates the photograph. So we call it an exposure. And there's three key elements that we use to capture an exposure, and that is light, time, and sensitivity. So light, how much light reaches the sensor, the duration of time that the light hits the sensor, and how sensitive the sensor is to the light itself. Think about it like volume on a stereo. You can turn up the sensitivity and you can turn down the sensitivity of the camera sensor to change in different lighting conditions. So first of all, let's have a look at light and the component that controls light, and that is the aperture, which I've already mentioned is the opening on the front of our lenses, within the lens elements actually, that will allow light to pass through it. And this also has a secondary effect. It controls our depth of field, making that out of focus background that everybody wants to achieve when they're capturing portraits. So it's the opening at the front of the lens, allows light to pass through and reach the camera sensor. It comes in different sizes depending on the phone, but there is kind of a general standard, which I'll speak about in a moment. It is measured in what are called f-stops or f numbers. This is very important. So you may have seen this before, something like f2.2, which is the standard that I was just talking about for the majority of phones, is f2.2. Don't worry about what the f means for now, we will come back to it. But if you're ever looking at the specs on a phone and you're wondering what that is referring to, it's referring to the size of the aperture within the lens. And as I mentioned, it also controls a secondary component as well as controlling the amount of light in the photograph. It controls our depth of field. So we can get a nice shallow depth of field, or we can also get a nice deep depth of field if we want to capture a landscape as well. But it cannot be changed, and this is one of the key differences with our phones compared to our cameras, our DSLRs, our mirrorless cameras, is that we cannot change the aperture on a phone. This can make capturing depth of field, shallow depth of field, a little bit tricky, but there is ways to overcome it, as we will see. So moving on then, our second component is our shutter speed, and this controls time. This controls the duration of time that the light hits the image sensor. And this will also control motion in our photographs too, so we can get these really spectacular shots like these light trails here. So determines how long the sensor is exposed to light. In regular cameras, it usually has what's called a focal plane shutter in front of it, like a curtain that will move out of the way to allow light to reach the image sensor. But within our phones, because they're so much smaller, that's removed, and basically the sensor then just becomes active for the amount of time that is needed to expose the image. So it controls motion and it can blur movement. We can also use it to freeze motion as well if we want to capture, these kind of sports photographs where everything is crystal clear and sharp. It is electronic, as I mentioned, so the sensor simply determines how long the exposure is, and it can be controlled in pro and manual mode. So unlike our aperture, it is possible to control our shutter speeds within our phones using the pro or the manual mode, we can set how long we want that light to come into the camera, so we can capture motion or we can freeze that motion as well. But there is a caveat to that, because we need to control the exposure, which is what we are going to be working up to. Now, finally then, the third component to our exposures is ISO, which controls sensitivity. And again, this is located within the image sensor itself. And ISO is changed when we need to capture images in low light situations, or we need to use very, very fast shutter speeds. We can make the sensor more sensitive to light, meaning that less light is needed to create the photograph. So in a situation like this, where you're at a concert, there's a lot of light in this image, but it is generally very, very dark, the ISO will increase so that it can get the correct exposure. So it controls the sensitivity to light. It can be increased in lower light situations where there's not a lot of light available, or we can also reduce it when there's too much light, like on very bright days. It is automatically controlled by the camera in most cases, but again, we can also adjust it in pro or manual modes as is needed if we need to add more light. Now, there is also a downside to using higher ISOs. It'll create noise at higher ISO ranges. So when we increase the ISO, we get this kind of texture over the photographs, which is called noise. It's not the same as grain. Grain is something a little bit different. That's something that we would typically find on film, because it was using light sensitive crystals. On noise, it's a digital artifact. It's something that's created by the image sensor, the pixel array on the image sensor. It's something we can manage, however, as well. It's something that we can correct through the use of editing. So when we bring these three elements together, we have what's known as the exposure triangle, a very familiar concept within photography. So we have our light, which is the aperture, we have our time, controlled by the shutter speed, we have our sensitivity, controlled by the ISO. These three components are balanced together to give us our exposure, our photograph. The exposure triangle. And what you're going to find throughout this course, and indeed just with photography in general, it's a little bit of a compromise. We're always trying to balance one thing with the other. Primarily, we should usually look at the aperture and the shutter speed, but it's a little bit different in phones because we don't have control over the aperture. So we're going to be looking at the shutter speed and the ISO as our two main controls for our manual exposures. Now, capturing an exposure, here's a very kind of crude way of how it actually works. We have our scene that we want to capture, we have our camera lens, and we have our aperture here within the lens. Light passes through the lens, through the aperture. So that's our light passing through here, and it is passed on, it's moved on, it's focused onto our image sensor, and our exposure is created. And that is a very basic way of how it all works. We have our scene, light passes through the light, through the aperture, through the lens, is focused to a point, it's projected onto our image sensor. The image sensor exposes the light for as long as it needs by using shutter speed to get the correct exposure. When we are working in auto modes, it does all of this itself. It works out everything in its computer brain to make sure that the correct amount of light is in the image. But as we know, it can sometimes get it wrong, and we can also control it then ourselves if needs be. But it takes a little bit of work, a little bit of practice. which is exactly what we're going to be learning later on in this course. Now, another very important term to get familiar with is resolution. And again, I'm sure you've come across this word before. It's used when it comes to anything involving images. So if you're watching television, or say you're playing games on your PC or anything like that, you're going to be very, very familiar with this term. Basically, our photographs, any digital image, is made up of pixels. Okay, so pixels are basically these little square blocks that create our images. The amount of pixels is known as resolution. So the amount of pixels that we have in any digital image is known as its resolution. 1 million pixels is a megapixel. So you might have seen this on your phones. I've got 21 MP. That means you've got 21 million pixels. More pixels means great zoom capability, means you can crop in very, very closely on a photograph. It does not mean a better looking photo. So how we work out our resolution is that pixels are multiplied by height, by width. So in other words, if we have 4,000 pixels going up and we've got 6,000 pixels going across, we multiply those together, that equals 24. A million pixels are 24 MP. Now, pixels can only ever be one solid color or tone. Now, in this example, I've just kind of created a basic version of it, just a simple kind of visualization of it. But in reality, in our images, if you were to zoom very, very closely in to the point where you could see the pixels, they will only ever be one color or one shade. No matter how hard you look, it'll only ever be one solid color or tone. Pixel size is determined by the image sensor size as well. So you might be wondering, well, if my phone has 42 megapixels and my camera has 18 megapixels, does that mean that the phone is going to take a better quality photograph? That's simply not true, because there's a difference in the actual physical size of the pixels. Larger pixels will produce a better quality photograph. We'll also have lots of other different effects and that, things that we'll speak about at a more advanced stage. So the actual size of the pixels does become a factor in image quality. But again, it's going to be very, very difficult to see that nowadays. It would only be at a very high-end professional level that someone might see the difference. But for the majority of us photographing, we'll never, ever see the difference. Now, so with all of that in mind, let's have a look at a phone. Lots of different settings available to us here, as we can see on it, and we can break down exactly what each of these little symbols that are on the phone. So hopefully this looks something like a phone that you're using at the moment, a similar array, a similar display on it. Let's break down each of these little symbols. So the first one we're going to start off with are our guidelines. So we can see that we have this kind of grid here on the phone, and set to the rule of thirds, something we'll have a look at in lesson 3, a compositional guideline. And it is just that, it's just a guideline to help you to make sure that your photographs are straight and that you can kind of place and compose the photograph to a way that is aesthetically pleasing. Beside that, we have our resolution. So we just spoke about it there. We can see in this case it's a 16 megapixel camera. Below that, we also have our aspect ratio. Again, we'll speak about that in lesson 3. That is the shape of the photograph. In this case, it's a widescreen shot. Beside that, we've got our ISO. We'll speak about ISO again much later on in the course. It's set to 400 at the moment. Don't worry about what that number means right now, but we can see here that the camera has gone ahead and set it to 400, which would actually probably be a little bit low in a scene like this. Beside that, we have our memory. So we've got our memory card, so it's indicating where the images are going to be stored. We can see how many images are also left available to us as well. Beside that, we can see that we're in still image mode. So, that will change if we change the mode, if we were, say, recording instead. We have a quick record button, so if we want to quickly take a video, we just simply press that button. We have our exposure button, we press that one to take the photograph. We have our front camera here if we want to switch it around and take a selfie. Some phones will also display what is known as a histogram. This is a much more advanced setting. This will show you your exposure values. So this is something for a much more advanced stage. We can use the histogram to read the exposure without even having to look at the image to make sure that everything is correctly exposed. Over on the other side, we have our settings. If we would quickly want to change settings, I can maybe change the photograph to black and white, maybe try out a few different filters, etc. We have our flash option. In this case, it's set to auto flash. In other words, the camera will determine whether or not it needs to flash for the scene. And then we also have our mode, and it's set to program or pro mode at the moment. Now, just one thing I failed to mention there as well. Obviously, within the center of the frame, we've got that yellow block. That is where we focus. So we can change our point of focus by simply touching the screen and choosing where we wish to focus from. Now, so that's a lot of info. I hope your attention isn't waning, but let's just perk you up again. And I want you to answer me this question. So which one of these was taken with a smartphone camera and which was taken with a professional camera? Now I'll reveal the answer at the end of the lesson, so be sure to stick around. But was it our Time magazine cover or was it Elle Australia? Which one of these you think was taken with a professional camera? Which one of these you think was taken using a smartphone? Now, you can interact with me if you haven't seen him already. We do have our chatbot, Morpheus. You can answer and ask questions through Morpheus. I'm sure you've seen him talk to you already. Remember, please, to rate responses that he gives you so we can continually improve them. The team here and myself personally, we have a look at all the responses that come in to make sure that Morpheus is actually giving you the right responses. So you can help us by rating those responses so that we can continually improve them for you. So do let me know which one do you think was taken with the professional camera or with the smartphone. Was it Time or was it Elle? And stick around until the end of the lesson to find out the answer. Now, so let's get you photographing by having a look at the different features and settings available to us on our phones. Now, I'll try to cover ones that are available on the majority of phones. But first of all, let's just quickly talk about the advantages and the limitations of our phones so we can understand what they're capable of. Now, obviously, the advantages of our phones is that they're small and portable. We have them on us pretty much all of the time. Very fast, very easy to use. One click, we got our photograph. We have instant sharing, which is just unbelievable, really. When you think about the history of photography, it could take weeks before you got your photographs back, but now we can take a photograph, we can upload it onto Instagram straight away, and in a matter of minutes we could potentially have thousands of people see that photograph and love it. We've got so many different apps that we can use for editing our photographs as well, to really enhance them and get the most out of them. And simply put, it is the most popular type of camera in the world. It outsells every other single type of camera out there. And it's great for nearly all types of photography. Now, understandably, there's certain types of photography that we're going to struggle a little bit more to do with our phones, but for the majority of the type of photographs that we will be taking, phones are great, and in particular they're fantastic for taking photographs of people. Now, they're always also improving on the technology as well, so it only ever gets better. I don't know about you, but every time I get a new phone, I'm always fascinated by how much the camera has improved. Of course, it's the first thing I always check out on it to see what is available to me. But there is limitations, and understanding those limitations will improve what we can do with our phones. If we understand the limits, we can work around those limits. We have a limited lens and image sensor size. This will affect quality in some instances. For the majority of times, if we're photographing or we're posting onto social media, Facebook, Instagram, that's not going to be an issue, but it can become an issue if we're trying to do something where we're printing very, very large. We might find that in that case, we might be a little bit limited. They can be really expensive. The latest iPhone, the OnePlus, the latest Huawei, Samsung, the top end ones are incredibly expensive. But of course, you're not just paying for a camera, you're paying for all the other features that are available as well. Some types of photography are difficult to do, like wildlife and sports photography can both be very, very challenging with phones. But again, that is improving every single day. Cannot change the aperture is a big limitation, because it does make capturing depth of field quite tricky, and they are still limited in their controls compared to DSLRs and other interchangeable lens cameras where we can change the lenses to suit our needs. They're not completely ideal for high-end professional work. So I'm talking at the very, very, very high end. Say, for example, you're photographing something for Mercedes. They're unlikely to want you to photograph it using a smartphone. But that said, if you're a very competent photographer, there's absolutely no reason why you wouldn't be able to do that. You just have to try and convince Mercedes with your photographs. So with that in mind, let's have a look at the first mode available to us, which is our auto mode. This is typically our standard mode where the camera takes complete control over the exposure. We don't need to worry about the exposure at all. All we do is point and click. You cannot adjust those settings, but that's fine. For most of the time, if we just want a quick snap, or perhaps you're just trying to document something, you're trying to photograph like a scratch on your car or something like that, God forbid, that you just want to get a quick photograph, auto mode, perfectly fine for that. It can get it wrong, and this is where people get frustrated with the auto mode, and why they want to move away from it is because it doesn't always get it right. In low light situations, or sometimes in very, very bright situations, it will get it wrong, and it just simply offers no control, no creative control. So, again, we're frustrated. We see a scene, we want to capture it in a certain way, how it looks to our eyes, and the auto mode just doesn't get it right. The This is why we need to move away from this mode. But anybody can use it. That's the brilliant thing about it. So if you're learning photography or you're doing it for the first time, you don't want to worry about your settings. Auto mode is great. You can just concentrate on looking and seeing and taking the photograph. So it's just great for everyday use. So it's just anything you want to photograph every single day. Auto mode should be, at least give it one shot, take one photograph, your safety shot in essence, using auto mode. So moving on then from that, the next mode we have is our Pro mode, which is sometimes referred to as manual mode, fully manual mode. More than likely it is called Pro mode, but do check it out on your own cameras. Now, not every camera does have this option available to it. Again, it depends on the type of smartphone you happen to be using, but it is becoming a standard feature. So the user controls shutter speed, focus, ISO, and white balance settings. White balance we'll have a look at in a later lesson number 5, when we talk about photographing landscapes in particular. But this will allow us to control and influence the color within our photographs. Again, we don't have any control over aperture, as I've stated. That's just simply not an option available to us at the moment. And it can be a little bit tricky to master because you have to understand exposure. You have to understand your exposure settings, your shutter speed, your ISO to get the balance of light correct. But it gives us creative control. So if we want to add blur to an image, if we want to freeze motion, or if we're struggling in a nighttime scenario to get a photograph, we can turn to the Pro mode and we can get the photograph once we understand what we are doing. Now, as I mentioned, some phones will lack this option, so always be sure to check what modes are available to you. And as I said, this will give you creative control. It'll allow you to own your photography that little bit more, that you can take a photograph and you can have a sense of pride in saying, well, I decided what shutter speed to use there. I decided what ISO setting to use there to get a particular look and to make a photograph more unique to you, and eventually develop your own style. Next, a very, very useful feature is our HDR, which is High Dynamic Range. HDR, and this is when the camera quickly takes multiple photographs at different exposures. So an underexposed photograph, an overexposed photograph, and a correct exposure, and it combines them together to create one photograph to give us a full range of tones. As you can see in the example here, this is a really good example because as we can see, the phone is actually seeing more than the camera that is taking the photograph, because we can see the sky in particular in this shot. So it's great for landscapes and backlit photographs. Typically when we're photographing, we can have trouble and we've got extremes in bright parts of the photograph and dark parts of the photograph. So again, like a backlit photograph, you're going to have a very, very bright sky or a very bright light in the background, and that kind of creates a silhouette effect, and sometimes that's what you want, sometimes it's not. And HDR is a great way of overcoming this because it'll get all of the details within the photograph. Sometimes it can give this hyper realistic look, almost unnatural look, but that's because it's actually allowing us to see more than we typically can see. Try to keep it steady in this mode for best results. So it's recommended, if you can, to use a tripod if you're doing landscape in particular. But if you're doing a portrait, just try to keep it as steady as possible for that split second, so that it gives you a nice, crisp, clear photograph. Now, as I said, great for tricky exposures like this shot of the Colosseum, where we've got the light in the background coming through, and we've still got all of that detail in the cobblestones in the foreground here as well. So this is something that would be typically very, very difficult for any photographer to capture without the use of special tools or complicated knowledge of exposure. With HDR, it allows us to overcome this quite easily and create these fantastic looking photographs. Next, we have our panoramic mode, or panorama mode, and this will allow us to sweep to create wide shots. Slow movement is needed here as photographs are stitched together, so take your time when doing this, like this lovely photograph of the Amsterdam canals, one of my favorite cities, made for landscapes, absolutely designed for capturing great stunning vistas, using the panorama mode. They are auto exposures, but it is possible to do a little bit of editing afterwards if we need to bring back some details. So really, we don't have much control, but you just want to take your time when doing a panorama shot. Now, finally then, just for our features for now, our food and macro modes as well. I don't know about you, I have a Samsung and it has a food mode, but really it also doubles as kind of a macro mode as well, and it's designed for close focusing. It's designed to allow us to get in a little bit closer and get those finer details. You can add a heavy, soft vignette. That means a kind of a blurred edge around the image to draw attention to the center. This is optional. You can switch it on, you can switch it off. It does help to kind of give a depth of field type of effect. It does replicate that shallow depth of field using that vignette. The depth of field is also something that will happen anyway if we get closer to a subject. Distance is something that affects depth of field. So when we're photographing food or doing macro, naturally you're going to get a shallow depth of field anyway. It can be called food mode, as I mentioned, but it's also great for macro and close-up photographs. And again, it's more automated exposure in this case. It's much more focused on getting that nice shallow, close depth of field effect. And just in general, phones are great for macro photography because we can just get so close to subjects, so close to objects, and capture them. They have a very small, minimal focusing distance, which means that they can focus in very, very closely on subjects. And again, we'll be digging a lot deeper into macro photography using your smartphone at a more advanced stage on the course. But our macro and our food mode, great for seeing all those little tiny details. It's a really fun type of photography to do. You can get quite abstract, you can get very artistic with it as well. Now, with macro in mind, I just want to give you a quick look at what's coming up in the next lesson. We're going to be talking all about different lenses and accessories. So we're going to have a look at more detail at the different types of lenses that are already built into our cameras, as some of them have more than one option. We'll also have a look at accessories that we can attach to improve our lenses. So for example, macro photography is one of them. We can buy macro lenses if you want to develop that side of your photography. Be sure to join me for lesson 2. And every single lesson that you attend will also develop and progress your skills. Broken it down into 5 areas here. technical ability, your vocabulary, your creative ability, your editing, and your advanced skills. Certainly in this lesson, our vocabulary hopefully has improved dramatically. So I have put that quite far ahead and take this as your starting point. Our editing, our advanced skills, these are things we're going to have a look at as we continue on, something that will be developed a lot more at a later stage. But our creative ability and our technical ability, these kind of go hand in hand. And when we develop each of these, we'll find that having more technical understanding offers us more creative ability. Now, so we're near the end of the lesson. We've just got one final topic to have a look at, and that's tips to get you started. I want you to finish this lesson and be happy to get out there and start taking photographs straight away that you feel that you are proud of and that you have actually learned something that you can apply to your photography to improve it. And the first thing I think any photographer should have is a trusty tripod. Tripods, no matter what type of photography you are doing, are I would see as essential to keep your photographs nice and steady. A good tripod will last a long time. I recommend that if possible to visit a camera shop as well to try them out. You can test them out with your phones. You can find one that's the right size for you depending on your needs. Manfrotto, the ones shown here, a very good brand, but they are also quite pricey as well. But very, very flexible, will pretty much fit any type of phone too. They're perfect for landscapes and particularly doing long exposures at night. It'll just keep things nice and steady and give you nice, crisp, sharp photographs. So definitely check out a tripod. Delay timer, this is one that I came across myself in a real life situation that I found to be very useful. I was at a concert there with my wife and her sister and my sister-in-law, and quite short, so she was struggling to take photographs above the crowd. So what I said to her was if she used the 2-second timer, so in other words you press the shutter button, it'll fire after 2 seconds. That gave her enough time to hold the camera or the phone above her head, above the crowd, to get the shot without struggling to try and reach it. And that way her shots were a lot sharper, a lot steadier, and she got some really terrific photographs. So do check that out. Most will have a 2, 5 or 10 second option, and you'll see a symbol that looks something like a clock. Focus on the eyes when doing portrait photography. We make connections with our subjects through the eyes. So if you're into doing portraits, always make sure to use that focus to touch onto the eyes to make sure that everything is nice and sharp. And the same goes for pets and for animals as well. We make connections through the eyes. As they say, they're the windows to our soul. So always make sure that they're sharp, as it's always the first place where someone instinctively looks in a portrait. Mix up your angles. Don't just shoot from eye level. Don't just shoot from your own height. Things will get very boring very, very quickly. So mix it up. One of the things that makes phones very, very advantageous in this is that you're only limited by how much your body can actually move. So point up, point down, get high, get low, and get those unique photographs. Photography is about seeing things in a different way, and mixing up your angles will absolutely show the world in a different way. When you're doing video, if you're a fan of doing video, please record in landscape. We tend to record in portrait, but we don't see the world in portrait, especially when we watch things like TV, or if we're in the cinema. When it's the last time that you saw something filmed in a portrait mode? Go landscape, and it'll give your viewers a much better sense of engagement. And finally, enjoy your photography. Don't overcomplicate it. Don't overthink it. Experiment with what you can capture. Photograph new subjects. You will find your style, and you will carve out a niche for yourself in time. But you'll only do that if you explore. Take your time. You're in no hurry. Photography is something that can be quite meditative and very enjoyable and extremely satisfying. You need to keep learning and improving. You're not going to be good after one lesson. You're not going to be good after 10 lessons. It's something that we do for life. And I am still learning every single day. And I'm finding new things every single day. And that's part of the joy of it all. Share your photographs. We can be quite private. We can be lacking confidence when it comes to sharing our shots. It is important to do because we can get feedback. It will also help us to develop our own critical understanding in regards to our photography. Explore new ideas and interact with other photographers. Interact with them on social media. Like their photographs, they like your photographs, and you might get new ideas, or even collaborate with somebody and start creating something really spectacular. And you build yourself your portfolio. You will add new shots to your portfolio every single day if you keep going out there and photographing, and you will see an improvement. Think about the very first photograph you took, and think about the most recent one that you took, and see the difference between them. And don't be too hard on yourself. Photographers tend to be self-deprecating and lacking confidence, as I said. But don't be too hard for yourself. Photography is fun. Have fun with it. And that's when you're going to get the best photographs. So, I do hope that you've enjoyed this lesson. As I mentioned earlier, I asked you a question. Which one of these was taken on a pro camera? And, well, I tricked you a little bit, because the answer is both of these images were taken on a smartphone. These were both shot with iPhones. I think there were different iPhones that were used, but it just kind of goes to show that it really isn't about the quality of the camera that you're using, that you don't need a professional camera to capture professional quality photographs. Now, certainly with Time magazine cover, I think a trained eye will see a little bit of the quality lacking compared to the L cover, but the quality of the light, the quality of the setup in the L magazine shot, you just wouldn't know that it was taken with an iPhone. And that kind of goes back to my point I was talking about earlier about photographing for Mercedes. I mean, it is possible to get professional photographs on your phones, so don't let anybody tell you that it is not. So, that is the end of our lesson. Thank you so much for joining me. Just a quick reminder as what's coming up in lesson number 2. We're going to be having a look at our different lenses. We'll talk about the lenses built into our cameras. We'll have a look at accessories that we can apply, and also those new phones that have multiple options available to them, like your telephoto and your wide angle lenses. And we'll have a look at when you should be using them in different types of situations. Please remember to rate the lesson. So congratulations on completing lesson number 1. Feel free to send us feedback and suggestions to support@shawacademy.com. lesson1.com. I do have a lesson challenge for you. At the end of every lesson, we will have a challenge. These are just for fun. It's a good way, though, of putting into practice things that you've learned at the lesson. So for your challenge for lesson number 1, I'd like you to display a photograph using at least one of the tips outlined in this lesson, and let us know how you found it useful. You can post these onto Twitter and Instagram. All you have to do is use the hashtag Shaw Smart Photo, and myself and indeed other students just have to search that tag. We'll be able to see the photographs that you are taking. You can also do it on Facebook as well. Simply hashtag Shaw Smart Photo, and we can find your work that way. It couldn't be easier. Take your photograph, upload it onto Twitter or Instagram or Facebook, and put the tag Shaw Smart Photo, and we will be able to see your photographs, and indeed you can check out other students' work as well. So thank you so much for joining me for lesson number 1. Well done on completing lesson 1. I'll see you all again very, very soon for lesson number 2. Until then, take care of yourselves. Bye bye.